Welcome, everyone, to an edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and government. My name is Eric Leupold, and thank you for joining me on today's episode. So today, I had the opportunity to speak with Luke Saint, who works with the Future of Christendom ministry, and he published a book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy. And he's also going to be participating in a debate at the upcoming Future of Christendom conference on October 11th and 12th on the topic of immigration. And so I had the opportunity to talk with Luke today about not just his book and the concept of theocracy, but about how to apply God's law to immigration. So I hope that you find this conversation interesting and thought-provoking. So without further ado, my conversation with Luke Saint. Luke, thank you for joining me today on the podcast. And just to kind of start us off, if you would tell my listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Eric. My name is Luke Saint. I'm the president of the Future of Christendom, which is an organization that seeks to promote God's law in all areas of life, specifically Christ and His rule, and what that rule looks like and what it has to say about our society, and how it affects current law and jurisprudence and culture and society, which is an area that the people at Future of Christendom, myself, my dad, Joel Saint, John Bingaman, Matt Kennitzer, Chris Hume, and Dave Stoltzfus, that's something that we feel the church is not addressing with the full counsel of God. So we kind of got started. It's a long story, but we kind of got started, and we started off as the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society, and we became Future of Christendom, and we are throwing a conference this year, October 11th and 12th, with Dr. Joe Boot being keynote speaker. But we also do podcasts, and we also do protests. We've done outreach and ministry and things like that. But right now, we focus mainly on our conference every year. Next year, can't say who we have because we haven't confirmed it yet. But next year, I think we've got a speaker lined up as well. And we focus on our podcast right now at Future of Christendom.
Nice. No, it's awesome. In fact, I was able to attend the conference last year.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I will be attending as well with several friends of mine this year. So very much looking forward to the talks there.
Excellent.
Yeah. So no, I certainly recommend anyone in the area who's able to attend, please do so.
Yes.
And that's why I wanted to have you on the show today, because, Governed by God, I also am very much interested in talking about how do we apply the Bible to civics, law, and government, and something that I think is very much lacking in our culture and our government today. And in fact, what inspired me for my title of this show is a quote from William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, who said, "If men will not be governed by God, they'll be ruled by tyrants." And
Awesome.
So that is that's what's going on today, and I have a chance now to read your book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy. So very much interested in that topic, and I know that the main topic that we want to cover today is immigration, and we'll talk a little bit more about the conference and the upcoming debate there. But whenever anyone hears the word theocracy, they often get triggered, or it can be disconcerting for some people. So I wanted to, ask you what led you to write the book, and kind of what is the basic main theme of the book.
I was online one day, and then someone asked a question on Facebook. They said, because they were in like a theonomy group, and they said, "Okay, I'm in this theonomy group, and this all sounds good, like well and good, like God's law, but what does it really look like? How would that affect society?" And I started to think about that. And I basically wrote the book because I was noticing that we were trying to hold hands with two animals that were opposed to each other, that were attacking each other. And we thought that we could walk two dogs at the same time, but we can't. One of them is the Constitution, and one of them is God's law. There are so many Christians that think that they jive. And one thing that I learned while serving at Future of Christendom was, the more we talked about this, the more I kept comparing what we were saying with does this jive with the Constitution? And the more I kept asking that question, the more I kept coming up with the answer, no, it doesn't jive with the Constitution. And even theonomists don't realize that. You know, I mean, a lot of people will say things like, well, you know, we got to get back to God's law, therefore we got to go back to the Constitution. Well, to go back to God's law is to actually criticize the Constitution. We've got to go, if we're going to go back to God's law, because what a lot of people say when it comes to the Constitution is, if we could just go back and use the Constitution the way it was meant to be used, we got to use the Constitution constitutionally. That's the problem. We're not using it constitutionally. I agree, but as I pointed out, or I was trying to make the point in the previous debate I did with Justin McGill a couple months ago, back in May, was that even if we follow the Constitution, bad things happen. If we follow the Constitution according to its original intent, purely like to what the framers wanted, here's what we want. If we follow it, bad things happen. Injustice occurs. And a lot of people just don't want to come to terms with that. They don't. They're like, it's a sacred thing. The church is not forcing their American populace to look at the Constitution and compare it to biblical law and find where they agree and where and most importantly, where they disagree. And I agree that there's an argument there we should be using the Constitution constitutionally. That's better than using it unconstitutionally. However, my question is, there's a verse in 1 Timothy where it says the law is good if it's used lawfully. And I was asking the question, who's saying that? Who's saying that we need to use the law lawfully? Because if we use the Constitution constitutionally, we have to use the government structure that the Constitution tells us to use. It calls for 3 branches of government. It calls for a Congress and a judicial branch, and obviously, the executive branch. That's what it calls for, right? And to go outside of that is not using the Constitution constitutionally. My question is, and why I wrote the book, was I wanted to see what society would look like if we use the law lawfully, like Paul tells us to do. The law is good if it's used lawfully. It's not laid down for the just, but for the unjust. And when I looked at the foundational philosophies behind, and this is at the intro to my book, but what I found was that the foundational philosophy, and I agree with John Adams, that the Constitution is meant for only moral and religious people. I get it. If everyone's a good boy, then the Constitution works. But we all say that about communism as well. If everyone's a good person, communism works. But we know the true nature, being Reformed Christians, of mankind is total depravity. So we have to, there are so many dyed-in-the-wool constitutional people that will not agree with the framer, John Adams. And what they don't realize is to disagree with the framer is like attacking a sacred cow. But if you do agree with the framer, that's what we're supposed to do, we're supposed to agree with framers, we have to criticize the Constitution and call it what John Adams called it. And he said, it's meant for moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. Now, are we a moral and religious people anymore? No. Are we going to say then that the Constitution is wholly inadequate? No. We're still going to be like, no, it's still. And so I was noticing a contradiction there. Are we going to agree with John Adams? That's wholly inadequate. And that you will not see anyone say that. You will not see anyone say that at all. They will not call it wholly inadequate. They will say, and that's like a quote in favor of it. And to me, I was like, this is a quote against the Constitution. And it's a quote in favor that it has Christian origins, Christian influence. But it's a quote against the reality of what we're dealing with when we talk about the Constitution. The Constitution is not fit for a wicked people. And we know as the heart of man, every inclination of our hearts is only evil all the time in Genesis 6. We need a governing document that takes into account that people are wicked. Because if John Adams is correct, it's not taking into account that people are wicked. It's hoping that everyone minds their P's and Q's. And that's not in touch with reality. And so when Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 1, the law is good if it's used lawfully, where he says the opposite of John Adams. I think a lot of people don't realize this, but John Adams says, okay, it's moral and religious people. Paul's saying the law is not laid down for the moral and religious people. That's not what it's for. The law is not laid down for the just, but the unjust. That's who the law is for. The law is made for an immoral and irreligious people, and that's what we have. That's what every nation goes down to. And so any governing system that doesn't take that into account is whistling Dixie. And so what I was trying to do with the book was say, listen, we have to come to terms with the fact that the Constitution is wholly inadequate. And what's going to happen, as you read in the back of the book there, what's going to happen when we balkanize and the Christians come together again? Are we going to say, hey, back to the fathers, let's do it again, and not learn the lessons of maybe that wasn't such a good idea? I mean, if it was a good idea, how would we know? And a lot of people say it's a good idea because it's most like biblical law. Well, my question is, why don't we just do biblical law then? Right? The further away we get from biblical law, the worse our society is going to be, right? So why don't we just do biblical law? And to get people to that point to criticize the Constitution in light of biblical law is extremely difficult because we're not being equipped by our churches. The churches are not preaching the law of God. They're not saying, hey, we need to be using the law lawfully. They will not say that. Those words will not come out of their mouth. No matter what you do, you cannot get people to say that we should be using the law lawfully. That is a concept that is so foreign to them. And so that's why we started Future of Christendom, was because we saw this need for Christians to think about these things. And everyone says this. Every ministry is like, we want people to think biblically. But this is an area where you have to basically criticize. We don't have to attack the Constitution. We're not trying to attack the Constitution. We're just trying to criticize it in light of biblical law. See, there's biblical law, and then there's everything else. And the Constitution is part of everything else. And a biblical law, there's claims about God's law that it's perfect. Who can discern his errors? That it's for all of time. I mean, Psalm 119 is all about the law of God. And that's not about the Bible. It's about Genesis to Deuteronomy. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about Ruth. Yeah. He's not talking about Isaiah. He's not even talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's talking about laws like if you come across a bird in the wilderness, you can take the eggs, but you're not allowed to kill the mother. That's what he's talking about. That's the immediate context. And it's so difficult to get Christians to make that connection. So that's why I wrote the book. I was trying to make the case with the book that the closer we get to biblical law, the better. I agree. But let's just do biblical law. It's couched in reality. It's a system that's tailor-made against the wicked nature of man. It promotes what God has given us to do, dominion. It is a dominion promoting apparatus. And it fully gives us power to fight the sinful nature of man. And not only was I mean, there's a lot of theonomist books out there, obviously, Rushdoony, North, Bonson. They wrote a lot of good stuff on theonomy. I was actually arguing for not only theonomy, but theocracy, which would be the actual governmental system that was set up in Exodus 18, which is just a judicial structure. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book.
No, that's fair. That's fair. And I appreciate you explaining that, because a lot of Christians, when it comes to the law, they don't understand it, or maybe they're a little concerned about how do they use it, or it's kind of a bad word. And so it kind of shy away from law in that sense. But you can't avoid a law of some kind. It's going to be theocracy, which simply means rule by God, essentially.
Yes.
Or you're going to have some other kind of rule. I'm glad that you're trying to communicate that. I've been trying to communicate that as well. It's either going to be the true God or some kind of false God that you're gonna develop your laws or your rules from. So. Yes. How did you kind of get to that point, I guess, where you understood how God's law is to be applied to the modern world? Because I think a lot of Christians struggle with how to do it. Like, they see these laws, and maybe they actually kind of think, those are good, and they agree with Psalm 119 and all the Proverbs and things like that. But then they're like, I just don't know how. How do you take that and apply it to today? Do you have any thoughts on that?
There was two things that started the thinking in that way. One, the most important one was to get the hermeneutic to look at the law of God, even the most weird ones that we think are, and conclude this is a good idea. This is a good idea. That's really what the hermeneutic is. Most Christians go to it and say this is a barbaric idea or this is a bad idea. There's some sort of negativity attached to God's system. It was for them. It didn't really work that well. Look at the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And I remember I heard a sermon once from a guy who was not theonomic. He was, I don't think he was a good preacher. I'm not sure what kind of person he was, but he just said, he made the observation as he was reading through Judges that they had uninterrupted rest for 40 years. I didn't really think about it at that time.
Hmm.
But when I started comparing the book of Judges to America, I realized that people were like, "Oh, 40 years, that's not a long time." And we're like, when have we had 40 years in America of rest?
That's
And if
fair.
you read through Judges, that's 40 years, and then it's 80 years, and then it's 40 years, and then it's 40 years. And that's at the beginning of the book of Judges. What people don't know, because I ask people all the time, and the answer is the same every single time. I've asked this time probably a dozen different people. Sum up the book of Judges, and they say everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What they don't understand is that phrase is used at the end of the book, 17 chapters in. You're 17 chapters in, and then you finally see that phrase. It begins a story, and at the end of that same story, it says it again. That phrase is used twice about the same story at the end of the book of Judges. Yet we conclude that the entire book should be summed up with that phrase. That is very poor exegesis on our parts. And I think the church is responsible because we have to conclude it because, again, the hermeneutic is that the law is a bad idea. It was a bad idea back then. It's a bad idea now. And whenever I argue with people about theonomy, that's what it always comes to. I remember I was in an argument with a guy, on Facebook. It was on Facebook, and I had accused him of thinking that the law was a bad idea because I'm like, I shouldn't have to be saying these things to you. You're saying you think that the law is a dumb idea. You thought it was a dumb idea then, and you think it's a dumb idea now. And he's like, no, you're breaking the ninth commandment. You're breaking the ninth commandment. You're bearing false witness, or, and I said, no, I'm not. And then he said, yes, you are. And then later, as we were getting more into it, he said, so Exodus 21 allows your daughter to be sold into sexual slavery. Is that what you want? And I said, see, there it is. There it is. You think that law was dumb then, and you think it's dumb now. You think when you read it that God was allowing people to sell their children into sexual slavery? That's the hermeneutic that I'm fighting against. And back in their mind, they're like this. They don't adopt the hermeneutic of Psalm 119 and go back and read the law in light of Psalm 119. They read Psalm 119 and they apply it to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then when they go back to read the law, they go to Galatians where Paul's like, the law for justification is inapplicable. You can't be justified by the law. It's a bad idea to try to think that you should be justified by the law. And then they interpret all the law in light of that. And they have never thought in their entire lives about where Paul says, the law is good if it's used lawfully. The law is not laid down for the just, but for the unjust. And then at the end of that short passage there in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he says, according to the gospel. And my dad always asked that question, how'd that word get in there? Wait, I thought the law and the gospel were always fighting each other. But here's Paul. He lists a bunch of civil crimes, not sins, civil crimes that were crimes back then. And according to Paul, there were still crimes today. And even the civil crimes are according to the gospel. And it is so difficult to get people to make that connection. So that was the first thing was read Psalm 118. Okay, here's the hermeneutic. Here's how the Bible views the law. This is the Bible's approach to the law. It kind of is like, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's hard to find a verse in Psalm 119, the biggest chapter in the whole Bible, that's not talking about the law. Yeah. And so I went back and said, okay, this is the attitude. I'm going to adopt this attitude. I long for your precepts. Your precepts are more to me than gold and silver. I'm more wiser than my teachers. I know more than my enemies. I'm more learned than the aged. Okay, I'm going to take that and I'm going to go back and I'm going to read the law in light of that hermeneutic. And once you start doing that, you start to realize this is a really good idea. And not only was it a good idea, it was a very successful idea, because when you go back and read the book of Judges, you realize that the land had rest. They had over 200 years of peacetime, something that America can't touch. And then you realize later, even after the kings, the phrase "the land had rest" doesn't appear again. And I think the only time it appears is one time. And that was, I think it was either King Asa or King Jehoshaphat. Can't remember which one. And that was only 10 years. 10 years. And you think, well, what about Solomon? Solomon, obviously that was the golden age. No, it wasn't, because when Solomon dies and the people go to Rehoboam and say, your father his workload was heavy upon us. Yeah. Please don't do what he was doing. And you realize, well, okay, so how did this happen? And then you go to Samuel's warning. Don't do this. The king is going to take. He's going to take. He's going to take. Don't do this. And then after they do it, Samuel's like, this was such a dumb idea that I am going to ask the Lord to bring thunderstorms upon your crops because of what you've done. And that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And the phrase governed by God is so appropriate because that's what I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Lord willing, we get a society where we go back and we undo that work where God said, they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me, that I should reign over them. And the question is, how do we get back to where God's reigning over us? And I make the argument that the civil structure of God's law has a lot to do with God reigning over us. Because right now, there are so many things that we look to before we cry out to God. We go to a police officer, we go to our institutions, we go to our institutional leaders before we think, God, help us.
Mm-hmm.
But God's system naturally points everything back to him. And the closer we are to the law, the closer we are to the gospel, because the law is always there to remind us that we can't do this by ourselves. And the more that we multiply our own laws, the more that we inundate our society with our own ideas, the more we can convince ourselves, hey, maybe I can do this without God. Maybe I can justify myself. If I follow these laws, that's exactly what the Pharisees were doing. They were far away from God's law. They were not close to God's law. They were not following God's law. The weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, they were not following that. And they were making laws and teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Mm-hmm. And they were not following the law. And that's what the problem that Christ had with them. I just wish you would do the law. And they weren't. They were doing their own rules. You can't take this many steps. You can't pick the heads off a grain. You can't give the money to your parents as Corbin.
Mm-hmm.
So they were doing everything but the law. And that's what we've done. And when I realized that was the first thing was, let me adopt this attitude towards the law. And let me go back and read the law in light of Psalm 119. The second thing was I was at a conference down in Tennessee, and I met a man named Chris there who was a Brit, and he casually said to me while we were talking, he said there was a study, I think it was the University of Chicago, that they did a study, and he said this to me as like a kind of like a novum, like something that's funny.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was they did a study on what happened to our freedoms after women were given the option to vote. And they made this graph basically where after the 19th Amendment, when women are given the right to vote, our freedoms started to plummet. But that wasn't my concern. My concern was that the freedoms were already on a downward trend. And I was like, wait a sec, why were we on a downward trend? Well, because people were voting our freedoms away. Well, how were they doing that? Well, they were voting on laws. They were voting in people who were promising them, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And I thought, well, how are they doing that? Well, we've given America the mechanism by which to change law, to institute our own ideas ad absurdum. And the legislative branch, which is something I talk about, and this is one thing that I'm trying to, the subtitle of this book is Statism in the Christian Mind. I'm trying to get people with this book to think about life without a legislative branch. And we are so inundated in our American society with we peaked, political science peaked with America. And I understand the argument, but I'm trying to get people to think, hey, Israel was superior in the time of the judges to America. They had more freedom. They had more rest. They did not have a legislative body. There was no one there making new rules. It was only after they got the kings that they started legislating. And that was part of the warning of Samuel, like this guy's going to start making up new rules. And that's what they did. But you didn't have that problem before then. The judges, they didn't have the institutional ability to create a new law and then make other people do that. And if you notice that God never led, as bad as they were, God never led Israel into exile during the time of the judges, as bad as they were. Everyone's like, oh, it was horrible, it was chaos. Well, if it was horrible and chaos, why did God wait for a king? Because when God led Israel into exile, he faults the king, Jeroboam, who sinned and led Israel to sin. But none of the judges had the ability to do that because they could not create laws, creating an apparatus, creating this tumor, because once you create one law, you never stop. It's like a tattoo. But it is like a cancer because you never get rid of old laws. You just keep creating new ones and new ones and new ones ad absurdum. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says, okay, well, when you reach this many laws, you can have only have this many. No, okay, stop.
Get your quota.
Yeah, right. Stop. It doesn't say that. And so we have hundreds of thousands of local laws, millions of state laws, tens of millions of federal laws. or vice versa. If you want to flip that one around, nobody knows. We can't count them. We don't get rid of old laws. It's very rare. And the problem is that when the founding fathers instituted a legislative body, they basically doomed America, because if they would have just did, okay, here's the laws, here's the executive branch, here's the judicial branch, and they never instituted the legislative branch, we would have had much more freedom, because giving man the ability to create law according to his own design has proved disastrous in the history of mankind.
Interesting. No, that's definitely stuff worth chewing on and thinking about, for sure, and having that conversation. And I do want to, now, with that said, kind of zoom in, narrow down onto the topic of immigration. Because if I'm not mistaken, that's going to be the topic of the debate that you'll be having at the conference. So that's a big topic these days. I've heard Christians on both sides advocating more for like a laissez-faire, libertarianism, open borders kind of concept, or more of the heavy-handed federal lockdown, walls, all the things. So given that situation, what can we glean from the Bible? What does the Bible have to say about that idea, that topic of immigration there?
So the case that I'm going to make is basically 3 points. One is the two greatest commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. I can be doing that and desire to go live in any country I want at the same time. There is no law that says, in God's law, that says you have to justify yourself to the civil authority of the nation that you're going to go live there, right? The civil authority is his responsibility. In Romans 13, his responsibility, his ontology is to be an avenger. You cannot avenge somebody who decided to move to another country. Completely unavengeable. There's no victim, there's no crime. If someone from Tanzania said, I want to go buy land in Montana and I want to bring my whole family and I want to bring my whole village, that's perfectly within his right. We must not punish where God has not punished, because then we're making up new crimes, right? The law of the Lord is perfect. So God's law never punishes anyone with, you're not allowed to live here. And did you swear to be a good boy? You didn't? Okay, well, back to your own country with you. That's never a crime. That's never a category of thinking. Banishment is not a civil penalty in the Bible. There's never anyone who's banished. I've never seen it. I've seen during the time of kings. I remember, I think one of David's enemies, he said, don't cross that line. If you cross that line, I'm going to kill you. But that was not a law of God, right? That was his own law. That was his own threat. So when I'm loving the Lord with all my heart, soul, and mind, and I'm loving my neighbor as myself, I can't be doing anything wrong beyond that. So anytime someone makes a law that's outside of God's law, that's punishing me, even though I'm following God's law, but I'm still being punished, my question is, what am I doing wrong? I can't be doing anything wrong if I'm loving the Lord with all my heart, soul, and mind. I'm loving my neighbor as myself, right? Because on these two things hang the law and the prophets, right? The law and the prophets rest on these two commandments. Love is the fulfillment of the law. So if I'm fulfilling the law, that means I'm loving my neighbor, I'm loving the Lord. Doesn't mean I'm perfect and that the law saves. Okay, let's just get that out there. Everyone's like, oh, you think you're justified? No. What I am saying is that even a pagan can fulfill the law legally, in that he can love his neighbor as himself. He can just be in his home or plowing his field, and maybe he's not a Christian, but if he's following God's law, and it's the law of the nation, maybe he doesn't realize it. He's inadvertently fulfilling the law, because even Paul says the pagans by nature sometimes do the things of the law. They don't know they're doing it. So if I'm following God's law and I'm fulfilling God's law, I'm loving a neighbor, I'm loving God, I can't be doing anything wrong beyond that, right? And my question is, and my wife always gets mad at me whenever I ask this question, because sometimes my wife will say something to me about something, and then I'll say, did I do anything wrong, right? And she hates when I ask that question. But the reason I ask that question is because if something is not wrong, my question is, why is it a law? Okay. If I'm not doing anything wrong, I can't be punished. Why am I being punished if I'm not doing anything wrong? For something to be illegal, it must first be immoral.
Sure.
If it's just illegal, but it's not immoral, that's tyranny, right? It's the arbitrary whim of someone up there making laws. So there is nothing in God's law that punishes someone to desire to go live in a different country.
Okay.
Just the government cannot see someone and say, hey, you didn't come and check with us first. You can't avenge them. Now you're
Yeah.
avenging yourself. The state's avenging themselves. That's wickedness. They are there to give justice between a man and his neighbor. That's it. So that's the first concept. The
Okay.
second concept is we have an immigration problem in this country because we don't enforce God's law. God's law, Deuteronomy 17 says, if there is one among you who goes out and says, let's go after other gods and starts worshiping gods, a public display of idolatry in a theocratic and a theonomic system is a capital offense. Unfortunately, our founding fathers, our framers, did not institute that. And when they did not institute that, the death of America was inevitable, because what ends up happening when you don't institute God's law and you give man the ability to institute his law, it's always antithetical to God's law, and it always ends up punishing the Christians. Christianity will be shoved out, and idolatry will be instituted. That's always happened throughout the history of mankind, 100% of the time. And so, because we don't institute that law and this other law in Deuteronomy 13, which says if a city or a political body comes out and says we are following another god, you are allowed and even responsible to go to war against them. Because we don't institute these two laws, idolatry is protected and even celebrated in this nation, while Christianity is suppressed. If immigrants coming to this country knew, okay, I'm allowed to be a Muslim, because the Bible never punishes a crime of status. All right, having a status is never a crime. Okay, you can say I am a Muslim. Okay, that's not a crime. But if you are caught publicly worshiping a false god, that is a crime. So God's law never forces anyone to believe in Christ or God. It never did back then, and it doesn't now. Because the sojourner you're supposed to love is yourself, and the requirement to live in Israel didn't. If you want to live in Israel, you never had to say, fill out like this form and promise to worship Yahweh. You never had to do that. You were just had to follow the law, which says that if you publicly do idolatry, you have forfeited your. And so if the immigrants coming to this nation knew, okay, if I go there and I start acting up, I'm going to get punished. About half of them would not come, and the ones who did come would be rewarded in their pursuits, because they would realize, okay, I'm here to take dominion. This system rewards dominion and it punishes sin. And so if you can function in that, I want you here. If you can function in that system, I want more people like that. But if we don't institute those laws, then idolatry is celebrated and rewarded and instituted. And it doesn't matter how big our wall is. It doesn't matter how many border agents we have. It doesn't matter how many rules we set up. If idolatry is protected and instituted, it does not matter what's on the outside. We will be destroyed from the inside. I was talking to my dad about this a couple of days ago, and he brought up what would you, in your mind, Eric, what would your mind be like the worst case scenario that we've seen, or not worst case scenario, but like give me an example of illegal immigrants doing something bad in the United States that you've seen?
Well, in the recent presidential debate that we heard, they're eating the dogs and they're eating the cats kind of thing.
Okay, so let me talk about the Haitians real quick. Okay, Haitians. People, especially now, are going to bring that up. Look what's going on. I raise you the 2020 Black Lives Matter riots. Immigrants?
No.
Were those immigrants? No. What do we do? This problem, I mean, is like, the immigrants, they're going to come here and riot. We have rioting. We have rioting right now by our own people. And you want to round these people up and ship them out? Do you think that would solve the Black Lives Matter riots if we just deported them all? Are you kidding me? And to get people to think about this in a biblical way is so difficult, because we're so focused on what could happen. We're avoiding what's happening now. What our worst fever pitch nightmare of what the immigrants are going to do when they come over here and just start wrecking things and eating our pets happened in 2020 with our own people. It was burning down our own businesses and our own cities. Those were Americans. Those were left-wing, Ivy League trained morons from their mom's basement, born and raised in our public school systems. Those were not immigrants, though I'm sure immigrants were involved. So my question is, give me the worst case scenario you think is going to happen, and I will raise you the reality of what's happening now.
That's fair.
With our own people. It's our own people.
Yeah.
I say this right now with respect to what's going on in Ohio, because I don't know, and what they're doing sounds horrible. And I wish those people in Ohio, I wish they had God's law instituted where they are, because God's law always protects the private property owner. Right now, the private property owner is not protected. If you try to defend your property, you're the one who gets in trouble. You're the one who gets sued. It's your fault. Right? So again, this is the problem of man's law. Eventually, it comes to attack this idea of dominion. I wish they could defend their private property. I wish they could defend themselves the way that God's law. I wish they could defend their pets if that's happening, because God's law gives them that freedom, that power, that responsibility, right?
I wanted to ask you a question about that, by the way.
Yes.
On the immigration, how the issue of private property comes into play in that discussion, because, just hypothetically, if the border of Texas, let's say all the land was owned by somebody, you got the one issue is a person on the border could say, I don't want no trespassing allowed. This is my property. And then B, kind of one level up, where does the role of the state government in relation to the federal government in the current system? I mean, I get that's definitely not necessarily ideal to what you're saying regarding God's law, but where does that play in, today?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Where are the the homeless illegal immigrants? Where are they hanging out? They are not hanging out on private property. Yeah. They're on public property.
Yeah.
That's where they all go. They go to public property and they just sit there. In God's system, everything's basically private property, right? We would not understand public property the way that we understand it now.
Correct.
With God's system.
Correct.
We understanding of public property. Okay.
Yeah.
We have the immigration problem today. Part of it is because we have this idea of public property. The state's not allowed to kick people out of public property the way that they should. It's just too much money, right? So again, this idea of we can be smarter and nicer than God. Let's let's take away people's ability to buy and purchase and sell land, and we'll have untouchable public property. That's where the immigrants are going. They're going and they're living in the public property. Now, if everything was supposed to be like it is under God's law, where everything's transactional, first you wouldn't have people crossing people's private land. Why? Well, because when I go to Maryland, I don't walk there. Why don't I walk to Maryland? I drive there because I have a car. I drive.
Yeah.
And it's not illegal for me to go into Maryland. I just drive there, right? Why would I walk there if I can drive there? Or how about this one? When I go to Montana, am I going to walk there? No, I'm going to buy a plane ticket and I'm going to fly in there. And let me tell you this, I know people closely who have walked through Mexico and they are still paying off the coyotes that they hired to take them through. Thousands and thousands of dollars that they're paying to these people to take them through. Is a coyote cheaper walking, or is it buying just a freaking plane ticket and flying into, I don't care, Milwaukee and buying land from somebody? Why were we still? I mean, this is the problem of thinking with a statist mindset. Well, if we open the borders, we'll just walk in. No, they'll drive in because it's not illegal. That's why they're walking. Because if they drive in, they won't get in. But if you open it up, they're just driving, and they'll go to a city and buy land or do whatever. Why did people come to Ellis Island? They came on a boat and then they rented property and they purchased it. Did they walk into America? No. Were they on life rafts? Let us in. Did they try to sneak on? No. They came in publicly and they came in very easily. There's the boat. Get on.
Yeah, it wasn't a secret.
It wasn't a secret. Right.
Yeah.
And we're thinking so short term about this because with the advancement of technology, and again, this is one reason why I'm a post-millennialist, or at least my post-millennialist ideology has led me to make this observation. But technology is a tool of dominion. We're reversing the curse, right? Obviously, Satan worked hard to get us cursed. And then God's curse, largely irrelevant to us today in the way that he phrased it. By the sweat of your brow, you will toil the land. Let me tell you something, brother. The last time I sweated when I tore the land, first of all, I don't even think about toiling the land. It's not me. I don't even think about that anymore, right? Full disclosure. I don't think about it. And Earl's out there in his freaking John Deere listening to Johnny Cash in his huge air-conditioned combine. Do you think he's toiling the ground by the sweat of his brow? Do you think he even thinks about that? No. It never comes into his mind. And what's the curse for the women? By pain. Well, what do we have? Epidural. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but I'm saying the option's there. And this is technology is a tool of dominion. What happens for all my strong border friends? What happens when personal flight becomes as common as a cell phone? What are we going to do then? Set up machine guns? Start shooting people down? That's my question. Because that's going to happen. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, nobody had a cell phone. But all the immigrants coming in, they all got cell phones. And this technology is more advanced than anything they have ever come into contact with in life, but they all have one. What are we going to start doing when personal flight is developed and they just fly in here in the cover of night on the border between Mexico and New Mexico where nobody hangs out? What are we going to do then? What about our strong borders? Do you think we can control that? And this is what I'm speculating here. This is not something I die on. But what happens when we develop teleportation? What do we do about all the immigrants then? What are we going to do? They just teleport here. But our transportation technology is always improving, and it's never going to stop improving. So what are we going to do when these immigrants don't have to worry about a wall or an ocean or transportation? They just appear here, which is happening right now, arguably via our politicians. God's law is a regulating system. It regulates the people the way that a border wall can never do it. If we don't punish wickedness and reward righteousness, which it says in Romans 13, it doesn't matter what kind of immigration policy we have. If immigrants coming here know, okay, if I am a wicked person, I will be executed or I will be punished correctly, then I'm not going to go there for that.
Mm-hmm.
But if they realize, okay, I can go there and I can live there safely, and I can do the original American dream. The original American dream was not the red sports car and the white picket fence. That was not the American dream. The American dream was my children can have a better chance than me at having a successful life, and their children can have it better than them, and their children can have it better than them. That's the original American dream. And God's law, the more we get close to God's law, the more we get close to that idea of, yeah, I might go over there and have a tough time, maybe with the culture and the language, but my children won't, and their children won't. And so that's one of the appeals of God's law. I mean, we often complain about, things aren't the way they used to be. Well, whenever you set up a legislative body, that guarantees that things won't be the way they used to be, because we're always introducing new law. And we always have to relearn this new rules. What's the latest law? What's the latest thing? And that guarantees that the society that we grew up in is not going to be the same that our grandparents grew up in, and also our grandchildren is not going to be the same. But that's what God's law was doing. Basically, the same society that Boaz grew up in was the same one that Joshua established back when they took over Canaan. And that allows tradition to thrive. When the law is not constantly changing, you don't have to relearn the new rules. Tradition and cultural inheritance is allowed to thrive in the way that all these weird white nationalist people are like, oh, but my father's inheritance and blah, 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 blah. If you institute God's law, your father's cultural inheritance and cultural traditions can really thrive. Mm-hmm. But you don't want God's law. You want status law. You want to round up these people and kick them out. Mm-hmm. Ridiculous.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I appreciate the insight on that and how to look at it from God's law's perspective. And time flies when you're having a good conversation, and we are coming to the end of the episode here. So I wanted to ask one final question. Basically, anything you want to say about the conference or about the upcoming debate, or where people can follow your work at.
So the conference, we're really promoting the conference this year. Christ is King. Dr. Joe Boot is going to be the speaker there. He wrote The Mission of God, which is absolutely a door-stopping, beat your professor over the head with work. It's probably the greatest, because it is a manifesto. It's a Christian manifesto. It's probably the greatest introduction to where we need to go as a country, as a society, as a church, as a family, that's been produced in the last 100 years. I mean, he is definitely like, this is the direction we need to go. So he'll be our plenary speaker. And there'll be a lot of other speakers there. Obviously, Chris Hume, who you've had on the show. My dad, Joel Saint, will be there. Ron Kranz, Matt Truella, who wrote Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates. Yes. He'll be there as well. Paul Michael Raymond. Some other guys who've been there last year. John Harris from Conversations That Matter. He'll be there. So they'll all be giving presentations, and we'll have the debate about, touching on the things that I've been touching on. Alan Miracle, who I've ministered with him on different occasions, or at least one occasion that I can remember. He's going to be debating me on the issue of immigration. He wrote a very good position paper on it called A Biblical Case Against Open Borders. And that is available, if anyone wants to read it, on Steemit, Steemit. It's called A Biblical Case Against Open Borders by Alan Miracle. So if anyone wants to check that out, go check that out. It's a very good position paper. And so we'll be debating the issue of immigration. And also I'll have my book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy, available for sale there. And Chris Hume will be there with his book, which I call it a companion piece to my book, Seven Stated Sins.
Yeah. Sounds like it's going to be a great time, and I hope that folks will consider purchasing a ticket if they haven't done so yet, and if tickets are still available. So again, thank you, Luke, for coming on the show and chatting today. And I hope to say hi to you at the conference. And I know you'll be focused on the debate, but maybe we can just have a little conversation when we get there.
That'd be great. Looking forward to it, Eric. Thanks.
Well, I hope that you found that to be a good conversation. And regardless of whether you agree with Luke or not on the topic of theocracy or immigration, I think it's important that we consider just how God's law is to apply to our lives and our states and our nations. And what does it mean to truly love our neighbors? So we need to think about these things, both in the realm of immigration, other topics as well. We can't be led by pure emotion. We need to let God's word speak to the matter. And so, anyways, I hope that you found that conversation useful. If you are interested in attending the Future of Christendom conference, it's in Mannheim, Pennsylvania from October 11th through 12th. And you can still register for the conference by going to futureofchristendom.org. Futureofchristendom.org. And you should be able to, I think, still purchase some tickets there if they're available. So anyways, maybe I'll see you at the conference. But if not, until next time, take care and God bless.